The end of Stalingrad. Narrator, calm but grave tone. By early 1943, the Battle of Stalingrad had ended. The once proud German Sixth Army, more than 300,000 men, had been destroyed. Frozen streets were filled with the dead. The survivors were starving, sick, and surrounded. Cut to slow black and white footage. German soldiers marching through snow, frozen tanks, dead bodies half buried in ice. For the German army, Stalingrad was not just a defeat. It was a graveyard. The might of the Third Reich had broken against the walls of a single city. And among those ruins lay thousands of men who would never return home. Fate and title: The Forgotten Soldier, the man who walked home from Stalingrad. The Fall. January 34, 1943. Stalingrad is a wasteland. The last remaining German stronghold, the tractor factory, is silent. Inside the frozen city, General Friedrich Paulus surrendered to the Red Army. It was the first time in history that a German field marshal had laid down his arms. The news spread across Europe like wildfire. Hitler's invincible army had fallen. Cut to map animation showing the encirclement of Stalingrad. Soviet forces closing in from both sides. The Soviets had trapped them, cutting off supplies, ammunition, and hope. The soldiers who survived did so by eating horses, frozen bread, even wallpaper paste. Disease spread faster than bullets. One man's escape. But among the ruins of this dying army, one soldier refused to surrender. His name was Hans Becker, a 28-year-old infantryman from Hamburg. He was not a hero, not a general, just a simple soldier, driven by one thought: to see his home again. Reenactment scene. Hans lying under rubble, half-conscious, hearing Soviet voices outside. He drags himself through a broken wall and hides in the cellar of a ruined house. When the final surrender order was given, Hans was already gone. He didn't believe in Hitler anymore. He didn't believe in victory. He only believed in survival. He finds a map from a dead officer's coat, half-burnt, showing a rough route west. He wraps his feet with torn cloth, grabs a single rifle, and begins to walk. Across the white desert. The journey from Stalingrad to Germany was over 2,000 kilometers. Through enemy territory, frozen plains, and war zones. No supplies, no allies, no mercy. Visual montage. Hans walking through deep snow, passing burnt vehicles, sleeping beside frozen rivers. Every step was a struggle. He scavenged from dead soldiers, melted snow for water, and followed the stars at night. Frostbite claimed his fingers. Hunger hollowed his eyes. But the will to live kept him moving. At one point, he finds a crashed German plane in the forest. Inside, a half-empty can of fuel and a frozen pilot. Hans takes the pilot's coat and lights a small fire. That coat, he later said, saved his life. The human side of war. Hans wasn't alone in that wilderness. He saw other men, some German, some Russian, wandering without purpose, trying to find food, warmth, or a reason to go on. One evening he stumbles upon a Russian farmhouse. An old woman opens the door, her eyes filled with fear. Hans lowers his weapon. She gives him a piece of black bread. In that moment, enemies became human. For a brief instant, the war outside seemed far away. He leaves before dawn, whispering "Danke," thank you, into the cold morning air. The price of survival. Weeks turned into months. Hans followed rivers, rail lines, and broken roads. He avoided villages, slept in barns, and crossed borders silently. By April, he reached the edge of Poland. The Red Army was everywhere, advancing west. German soldiers were being hunted or captured. Hans hides in a trench filled with bodies. The smell of death nearly makes him faint, but he waits until nightfall to move. To survive Stalingrad was a miracle. To cross Russia on foot, impossible. Yet somehow Hans Becker was still alive. The long road west. Narrator, deep steady tone. By the spring of 1943, the snow around Stalingrad began to melt. The rivers flowed again, but for the thousands of German prisoners left behind, hope had already frozen to death. Only a few men managed to slip away before the Soviet noose tightened completely. Fade to visuals. Abandoned trenches full of helmets and rifles. The Red Army searching through destroyed bunkers. One shadow, Hans Becker, moving slowly through the fog. Hans had no map, no compass, and no plan. But he had direction, west. Every step away from Stalingrad was a step toward home. The road of death. Hans followed a broken railway, line that stretched endlessly across the Russian steppe. He walked mostly at night, when the sky was a dark ocean of stars and the earth beneath him crunched like glass. The rail lines were littered with the wreckage of war. Burnt trains, dead horses, shattered wagons, each one a reminder that war devoured everything in its path. Sometimes he would hear distant artillery or the hum of Soviet trucks. He learned to freeze in place, blending with the landscape like a ghost. "If I move, I die," he whispered to himself. "If I stop, I die slower." The body begins to fail. After weeks of walking, hunger became Hans's greatest enemy. He was surviving on grass, bark, and whatever he could scavenge from the dead. One night he found a can of frozen soup beside a destroyed German camp. It was covered in ice, but it tasted like life. He wasn't fighting the Soviets anymore. He was fighting nature, cold, hunger, and despair. Frostbite blackened his toes. His hands shook so much he could barely hold his rifle. But still he moved. A ghost in the villages. As he crossed into the rural edges of Belgorod, Hans began to see villages again, half burnt, half abandoned. At first he avoided them, but when his hunger became unbearable, he risked it. Reenactment scene. Hans sneaks into a small hut at night. He finds a loaf of bread and a bucket of water. A young boy wakes up, sees him, and freezes in terror. Hans puts a finger to his lips. He doesn't take the bread. Instead, he gives the boy his silver ring, his last possession. Then he leaves quietly. Even in the darkest war, there are moments of mercy. For Hans, it was not about right or wrong anymore, and only about staying human. The train yard. Days later, Hans reached an abandoned train depot near the Ukrainian border. Dozens of freight cars stood silent, bullet-riddled and frozen in place. Inside one of them, Hans found something extraordinary. A German field medical kit left behind in the chaos of retreat. Inside, bandages, a little morphine, and 2 chocolate bars. For a starving man, it was a treasure beyond gold. For a soldier, it was a reminder of the world he once knew. He stayed there for 2 days, hiding among the wreckage, regaining strength. He treated his wounds, patched his boots, and waited for nightfall before moving again. A shadow in the night. The further west Hans went, the more dangerous it became. The Soviets were advancing, and German deserters were being shot on sight, by both sides. One night as Hans crossed an open field, he saw torchlight ahead, Soviet patrols. He dropped to the ground, heart pounding. A flare burst overhead, lighting the snow in white fire. He didn't move. Not even when a soldier's boots came within meters of his face. The patrol passed. Hans lay there for an hour, trembling in the cold, before crawling away into the darkness. For a man like Hans, every breath was borrowed time. The woman in the cottage. Weeks later, near a small village in western Ukraine, Hans found refuge again, this time in a small wooden cottage. Inside lived a widow named Anya, whose husband had been killed by the Germans the previous year. When she first saw Hans, she raised an axe in fear. But when he collapsed at her feet, bleeding and feverish, she hesitated. War had taken everything from her, but not her compassion. Anya treated his wounds with boiled herbs and covered him with a blanket. For 2 days, Hans slept, drifting between fever and memory, dreaming of his wife, his home, and the life that no longer existed. When he awoke, she gave him a bowl of soup. Neither spoke the other's language. But when he whispered Danka, she understood. Before he left, she handed him a wool shawl. He wrapped it around his shoulders and continued west. In a world of death, a stranger's kindness became his only proof that humanity still existed. The crossing. By June 1943, Hans reached the Polish frontier, a land shattered by both German occupation and Soviet revenge. The skies thundered with bombers. Villages burned in the distance. Hans moved only at night, hiding by day in barns, cemeteries, or drainage ditches. Poland was a graveyard, filled with ghosts from both sides. The war had turned entire towns into ashes. At one checkpoint he saw German soldiers, his own army. But he didn't reveal himself. He was afraid they'd shoot him for desertion. They wouldn't understand, he thought. No one would. The execution pit. One night Hans stumbled upon a deep pit filled with corpses. Polish civilians executed by German forces. He fell to his knees horrified. He realized the war he fought for had become something monstrous. The propaganda he believed in shattered. The Reich wasn't a dream anymore. It was a nightmare. He whispered to the bodies, "I'm sorry." Then he walked away in silence. And the train to nowhere. At the outskirts of Lublin, Hans managed to climb aboard a moving freight train, a desperate gamble. He hid between crates, exhausted. But after several hours, the train stopped suddenly. He peered outside and froze. The train wasn't carrying supplies. It was carrying prisoners, hundreds of them, packed in cars guarded by SS troops. He realized where he was, near a concentration camp. He had fought for an army that was killing the innocent. For the first time, Hans began to question if going home even mattered. He jumped off the train that night and rolled into the darkness, toward the west. Hans Becker's journey through Poland was one of pain, guilt, and survival. He had crossed nearly 1,000 kilometers. His body was weak, but his spirit refused to die. He followed the setting sun, toward Germany, toward home. But deep down, he already knew. Nothing would ever be the same again. Fade out with cinematic music, distant wind, fading heartbeat. By late summer 1943, the Eastern Front had become a shifting sea of chaos. The Red Army pressed westward, the Germans retreated, and the land between them was no man's land, lawless, burned, and silent. Visuals fade in, empty fields, smoke drifting, distant gunfire. In the center of the frame, a single figure moves slowly, Hans Becker. The edge of Germany. Hans followed the Bug River, the natural line dividing occupied Poland from German East Prussia. The bridge had been destroyed. The water beneath it ran black with oil and ashes. The way home lay just beyond that river, yet it might as well have been an ocean. He waited until nightfall. Using planks torn from a barn, he built a crude raft. Halfway across, Soviet searchlights swept the banks. Hans slid into the icy water and clung to the wood until the beam passed. When he reached the far side, he lay there for hours, coughing and gasping, but alive. The Gestapo roadblock. The first village he entered carried the black-white-red flag of the Reich. But the sight brought him no comfort. Posters lined the walls, "Deserters will be shot," and beside the road, a wooden post with 3 bodies hanging from it. The fatherland he had dreamed of returning to had become a prison built by fear. 2 Gestapo trucks appeared in the distance. Hans ducked into the rubble of a barn. Inside, he found another deserter, gaunt, trembling, uniform torn of insignia. The man pressed a finger to his lips. Minutes later, gunfire cracked outside. When silence returned, the man whispered, "They shoot everyone now, soldier or civilian. Run while you can." Hans never saw him again, a soldier without an army. He avoided roads, moving through forests thick with fog. Every ruined farmhouse looked the same, windows shattered, letters unread on tables. To the German high command, men like Hans did not exist. They were ghosts, reminders of defeat. One evening, he reached an abandoned supply depot. Inside were crates of helmets, gas masks, and blood-stained uniforms. He stripped the insignia from one jacket and wore it, not as a symbol, but as camouflage. If they see a uniform, maybe they'll let me pass, he thought. The field hospital. A few miles west, Hans came upon a German field hospital overwhelmed with wounded. He slipped inside, hoping for food or medicine. Doctors moved like shadows under dim lanterns. The smell of gangrene filled the air. A nurse stopped him. "Where's your unit?" He hesitated. "Stalingrad." "I'm all that's left." She stared at him for a long moment, then quietly led him to a tent. Inside lay soldiers without limbs, whispering prayers. She gave him bread and whispered, "Eat, but don't stay. They'll send you back to the front." That night, Hans slipped away again. The deserted city. By September 1943, Hans reached Königsberg, once a proud German port, now half evacuated, half destroyed by Allied bombers. He walked through streets covered in ash. Children played beside craters. Old men searched for bread among rubble. He stopped outside a church, its roof torn open, bells silent. Inside, a priest was collecting pieces of broken stained glass. Hans asked quietly, "Does anyone remember Stalingrad?" The priest looked at him and said, "We remember, but we do not speak of it. It brings shame." Hans bowed his head and left. In his homeland, truth had become forbidden. The war machine demanded silence, even from its ghosts. The bombing run. That night the sirens wailed. The sky filled with Allied bombers. Searchlights crisscrossed the heavens. Hans ran through the streets as explosions tore the city apart. He threw himself into a ditch as fire rained down. The same empire that had destroyed Stalingrad was now burning in return. When dawn came, smoke covered the horizon. He saw mothers digging through debris for their children, soldiers carrying bodies on stretchers. Hans realized that death had followed him home. The propaganda machine. As he continued westward, he passed through small towns where radios blared victory speeches. Posters claimed final victory is near, while trains full of wounded rolled past silently. Reality and propaganda lived side by side, one fed on lies, the other on suffering. In a railway station, Hans saw an officer shouting at refugees. The officer's uniform was spotless, his boots polished. Hans looked at his own, torn, covered in mud, stained with months of pain. Their eyes met briefly. The officer looked away first. The house by the lake. Weeks later, Hans reached a quiet lake village near Berlin's eastern frontier. He collapsed at the doorstep of an old woman's cottage. When he awoke, he was lying on a bed for the first time in nearly a year. The woman, frail, kind, told him her sons had both died in the war. She didn't ask who he was. She didn't need to. For 3 days, she cared for him. He chopped wood, fetched water, repaired her fence. When he left, she gave him a loaf of bread and said, "You remind me of my Carl. Go home if home still exists." Every act of kindness was a rebellion against the war itself. The final border. By October 1943, Hans finally reached the outskirts of Hamburg, his hometown. But it was unrecognizable. Entire districts flattened by Allied bombs, the harbor a sea of twisted metal. He walked down the street where his family once lived. There was nothing, only rubble and silence. He found the ruins of his house. Among the ashes, a single object gleamed, his wife's silver locket. Inside was a photo, her smiling face, their baby daughter. Hans sank to his knees, the locket trembling in his hands. Narrator, softly. He had walked 2,000 kilometers through war, snow, and fire, only to find that what he sought was already gone, the return without victory. Hans stayed there until nightfall, staring at the ruins. Then he walked toward the river and sat under the broken bridge. He didn't cry. There were no tears left. For some men, survival is not a triumph. It is a sentence. He never returned to the army. He disappeared into the countryside, living quietly under a false name. Some say he died in 1946. Others claim he wandered east again, unable to find peace anywhere. Epilogue voiceover. Hans Becker's name never appeared in official records. He was one of millions erased by history. Soldiers who fought, fled, and fell in silence. His footprints vanished beneath the snow. But his story reminds us that war does not end when the guns go silent, fade out on a slow aerial shot of the Volga River, turning to winter once more. The endless road home. Words in 1500. The winter of 1943 had shown no mercy. Hans Becker, a man once defined by crisp German uniform and discipline, was now little more than a ghost draped in rags. His face was pale, his lips cracked from frostbite. And his boots, once polished, black, had become torn, leather wrapped with cloth and rope. Yet he walked. Every day, every night. The map he once trusted had long been lost. Now, the only compass he had was instinct, and a single direction in his heart, west. Home. The silence of the dead. For days he wandered through a land of death. Frozen soldiers, German and Russian alike, lay scattered in white fields, their bodies preserved in the snow like statues. Horses frozen mid-step, rifles half buried in frost. The ruins of war stretched to the horizon. Sometimes he spoke to them. "Did any of you make it out?" He would whisper, his voice trembling. Only the wind answered. In his isolation, Hans began to question his sanity. He could hear voices, the echo of his commander shouting orders, the laughter of comrades now gone. He would jolt awake at night, thinking he heard footsteps, only to find nothing but the endless whisper of the snowstorm. Still he pressed on. The encounter. One morning, as a gray dawn broke over the horizon, Hans saw smoke rising from a small village ahead. His heart leapt. People. He crawled down a slope toward the houses, careful not to be seen. From behind a fence he watched. Wooden huts, half buried in snow. A few figures moving, Russian peasants. A child dragging a sled. An old woman carrying water. No soldiers, no guards. Starving and weak, Hans made a desperate choice. When night came, he sneaked to a small barn and knocked softly on the door. An old man opened it, gray beard, worn coat, suspicious eyes. "Please, I am lost," Hans muttered in broken Russian. "Just food, a little." The old man stared at him for a long moment, then motioned him inside. Hans fell to his knees, nearly fainting. The man's wife, without a word, placed a bowl of soup before him. He ate like a dying animal, After a long silence, the old man said quietly, "You are German?" Hans froze. The old man nodded before Hans could reply. "I fought in the Great War," he said softly. "We were enemies then too, but not now. Now we are all just men trying to live." That night Hans slept in their barn. The old couple gave him an old blanket, and for the first time in months, he felt the warmth of kindness. At dawn, before leaving, Hans bowed deeply. "Thank you," he said. "You saved my life." The old man only replied, "No one wins a war, son. They just survive it." Crossing the frozen rivers, Hans continued west, moving mostly at night to avoid Soviet patrols. He followed frozen rivers, silent highways through the wilderness. But nature was as deadly as any army. The ice cracked under his feet. Once he nearly plunged into the freezing water. Another time wolves followed him for miles, their howls echoing in the night. He carried no gun now, only a stick and his will to live. When hunger struck, he chewed bark, melted snow, or dug up frozen potatoes from abandoned fields. His body wasted away, but his spirit, astonishingly, remained. One night he stumbled upon the remains of a destroyed convoy. Among the wreckage he found a torn German jacket with an iron cross still pinned to it. He held it in his hands, staring at the metal. He whispered, "What was it for? Glory or madness?" Then he left it behind. A village in ruins. Weeks later, Hans reached another village, this one in ruins. Burnt houses, destroyed carts, silence everywhere. Only a small chapel remained standing, its roof half gone. Inside, he found a single candle burning and a young Russian woman kneeling before a cross. When she turned and saw him, she did not scream. She simply said, "You look like death." "I am," Hans replied softly. She gave him bread and a flask of water. Her husband had died in the war. She didn't care which side Hans was on. "All soldiers are the same," she said bitterly. "They kill, they cry, they go home, if they can." Hans stayed one night in that chapel. He could hear her weeping as snow fell through the broken roof. The endless march. By spring 1944, the snow began to melt. Hans had walked hundreds of kilometers, through villages, forests and war-torn fields. Once he saw a train filled with German prisoners heading east. He hid behind trees as Soviet soldiers laughed and pointed rifles at them. He wanted to shout, to join them, but he knew it meant death. Sometimes he wondered if going home was even worth it. What if his town was gone? What if no one waited? But when despair crept in, he remembered his mother's voice, calling him by name. That was enough to keep his feet moving. The message in the snow. One day he found something extraordinary. On a frozen wooden post beside a road, someone had carved in German, "To those still walking west, keep going. You are not alone." He ran his fingers over the words, tears in his eyes. Maybe others like him still lived, lost souls trying to find their way home. That message became his beacon. He pressed forward, limping, coughing, but unbroken, to be continued. In the next part, Hans finally crosses into Eastern Europe, where the war's front lines shift again, and he faces his most painful truth. Home may no longer exist. Spring was breaking. Through the frozen plains, as Hans Becker reached what was once the border of the German-occupied territories, the snow had thinned, and patches of muddy earth showed beneath his torn boots. Birds were returning. The rivers had begun to thaw, and for the first time in months, the wind carried the scent of grass instead of death. Hans's beard had grown wild. His eyes were hollow yet sharp. His body had been consumed by the road, but his mind, still burning with one desperate thought, whispered, "Home." He didn't even know if his home still stood, but it didn't matter. Every step westward was a promise to himself that he had not died for nothing. Crossing into chaos. As Hans crossed into Poland, he realized something terrible. The war had not ended. Villages were still burning. Refugees, women, children, the elderly, wandered aimlessly along the roads. He saw German soldiers retreating, their once proud uniforms torn and dirty, their faces defeated. One officer barked orders at a column of men dragging artillery through the mud. Hans stepped aside, hiding behind a fence. He could have joined them, but he didn't. He was no longer a soldier. The war had taken that from him. That night he overheard two soldiers talking near a fire. "They say Stalingrad was hell." "Hell? This whole continent is hell now." Hans moved on silently, avoiding patrols and checkpoints. Everywhere he looked, he saw what the war had done. Families separated, homes destroyed, entire towns erased. The abandoned train. Near Krakow, Hans found an abandoned railway line. On it sat a derailed train, its metal still warm from a recent fire. Curious, he climbed inside one of the wagons. What he saw made his blood run cold. Hundreds of shoes, children's toys, and tattered clothes were scattered across the floor. The smell of smoke and something darker lingered in the air. He didn't understand, not fully. But something deep inside him whispered that this was not a normal transport. He stepped back out, staring at the black smoke that still curled into the gray sky. War had turned men into monsters, and even the monsters no longer knew why they killed. He walked away in silence, not daring to look back. The fields of the lost. Days later, he entered the ruins of a small German outpost. Inside, he found a half-burnt notice board covered with fading papers, missing soldiers, last letters, names of the dead. Hans searched desperately among the lists. His hands trembled as he found it. Becker Hans, missing presumed dead Stalingrad. He stared at the words for a long time. He was already dead in the eyes of his country. The thought hit him harder than hunger or cold ever had. He wasn't returning home as a man, he was returning as a ghost. The woman by the river. On the outskirts of a destroyed town, Hans saw a woman washing clothes by a river. He approached carefully. She looked up startled, then softened when she saw his face. "You're German?" she asked. "Yes," Hans said. "Trying to get home." She nodded slowly. "There are no homes left here," she said. "Only graves?" They sat in silence as she handed him a piece of bread. "Where are you from?" she asked. "Dresden," he replied softly. Her eyes widened. "Dresden was bombed," she said quietly. Many people died." Hans froze. "When?" "Last month." The sky burned for days. He felt the world collapse inside him. The bread fell from his hand. His mind refused to believe it. Dresden? His mother? His sister? He couldn't speak. The woman touched his arm gently. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Hans stood staring west. For the first time, he didn't know whether to keep walking the burned road to Dresden. Despite the pain, Hans continued. Each village he passed seemed emptier than the last. Sometimes he saw German civilians fleeing west, their carts piled with what little they had left. Allied planes flew overhead, their engines echoing like distant thunder. When he finally reached the outskirts of Dresden, it was night. The city no longer existed. Where once stood streets, houses, and churches, there was only blackened rubble. The air still smelled of ash. Twisted metal and shattered bricks stretched as far as the eye could see. Hans stumbled through the ruins, coughing from the smoke. He walked past skeletons of buildings he once knew, a bakery, a school, the church where he'd been baptized. All gone. He reached the spot where his house should have been. Nothing remained but a few stones and a burned iron gate. He fell to his knees. For a long time he said nothing. The wind blew ashes around him like snow. He whispered, "Mother, I made it home." The letter in the rubble. As he searched through the debris, he found a small metal box buried under the stones. Inside was a half-burned photograph. His family, smiling before the war. Tears filled his eyes. He also found a piece of paper, part of a letter, barely legible. "We heard about Stalingrad. They said no one survived. If you ever come home, we will be waiting." The ink had run, the rest burned away. Hans folded the paper carefully, holding it close to his chest. They had waited, and the war took them before he could return. The man who refused to die. Hans lived for weeks among the ruins. He scavenged for food, slept in bombed-out basements, and buried what little he found of his family in the garden that no longer existed. Other survivors came and went. Some recognized him, most didn't. He never wore his uniform again. He was no longer a soldier. Just a man who had walked through hell and returned to ashes. One day a young boy asked him, "Mister, were you in the war?" Hans smiled faintly and replied, "Yes, but I lost more than I fought for." The boy nodded, not understanding, and ran off. Hans looked up at the sky. Planes still flew overhead, but this time he didn't flinch. He whispered, "You can't bomb what's already gone." Epilogue, The Forgotten Soldier. Years later, when the war ended, few remembered men like Hans Becker. His story was never told in history books. No medals were pinned to his chest. But those who met him, the peasants who fed him, the refugees who saw him walking west, the children who heard his quiet voice, they remembered. He became a legend whispered in the ruins. There was once a man who walked all the way from Stalingrad and never stopped walking. Hans Becker's journey reminds us that survival is not always victory. He escaped the deadliest battle in history, only to find his world already gone. In war, some die quickly. Others die slowly, step by step, on the road back home.